Analogy. What is an analogy? An analogy is a comparison of the relationships between different groups of objects. Now, if you think this is the definition of analogy, a comparison between two objects, that's incorrect. Rather, the definition, look at it carefully again, is a comparison of the relationships between groups of objects. Relationships is the key word here. When anyone uses an analogy, they're not really comparing the objects so much as the relationships between one group of objects and the relationship between another group of objects. For example, the solar system and atoms. Now, when people discovered atoms, they had already known what the solar system was like. So in order to give some type of explanation, in order to help people understand what atoms were like, they explained it in similar terms to the solar system. They gave an analogy from the solar system. Here's an example. Atoms are like the solar system. They have a nucleus, which is made of protons and neutrons, which are like the sun. They're in the center of the atom. And they have electrons also, like planets orbiting the nucleus. So sometimes there are many orbits of electrons, like there are many planets orbiting the sun. The idea here is that the atom, if you want to understand it, you can do so by comparing it to the solar system, comparing the relationship between the nucleus and the electrons with the sun and the planets. Here's another example. The gym and reading. The more and more you go to the gym and exercise well, you will build muscle. Reading is like going to the gym. The more and more you read and understand, you will become more intelligent. Now, the idea here is that the relationship between the gym, exercise, and building muscle corresponds or is similar to the relationship between reading, understanding, and becoming intelligent. So just as you go to the gym, you exercise, you build muscle, when you read and understand, you will become more intelligent. Now, the purpose of this analogy specifically is to make an abstract concept, which is non-physical, which is the activity of reading, understanding, and becoming intelligent, understandable through a concrete or a physical concept. So you understand the non-physical concept, the non-physical activity of reading, understanding, and becoming intelligent through a physical concept of going to the gym, exercising, and building muscle. Example number 3. Gasoline and food. You can't expect to do well without eating. You're like a car without gas. Without food, you will not be able to get anywhere or do anything. And the relationship here between gas and cars corresponds, or meaning it's similar to, the relationship between food and the body. Just as the car cannot move forward without gas, the body cannot really do work without food. Example number 4. Shutting down and sleeping. You need to shut down every day, otherwise you will get a lot of problems. You may even crash if you don't shut down regularly. Now you notice, the way this analogy is worded, it's describing a computer. But in reality, this person is describing a person as if they were a computer to make clear how important sleep is. So for example, the relationship between shutting down and the computer working corresponds or is similar to the relationship between sleeping and overall health in humans. Now, why do people use analogies? It's for many reasons. It helps people understand a usually difficult concept by connecting it to older and familiar knowledge. So you understand a new idea or a new discovery in science by connecting it to older and familiar knowledge. We saw that with the example of the solar system and atoms. When people discovered what the structure of atoms was like, most people were familiar with the structure of the solar system already, from hundreds of years before. You have the sun at the center, the planets orbit around the sun. So scientists used that example of the solar system as an analogy to help describe what the new understanding of atoms was, which is a nucleus orbited by electrons. But also, analogies are used to persuade, convince people to think a certain way about certain objects and ideas. We saw that with the example of how reading is important. The analogy was comparing it to going to the gym, exercising, and building muscle. So they gave the idea that reading builds intelligence. It's there to persuade people to think a certain way about reading, how important reading is for the mind. Also, the example about gasoline and food was there to persuade people how important it is to eat. Because just like a car does not work without gas, people know that very well. Also, without eating, your body's not going to work very well. You're not going to be healthy. So those two analogies were there to help persuade people to think a certain way about reading and about eating. Here's one more example of an analogy. The mind is not a vessel to be filled, but it is a fire to be kindled. It comes from Plutarch in his work on listening to lectures. Now, the idea here is a vessel is like a pail, like a bucket. The mind is not like that, but it's like a fire. And why? Because Plutarch wants the people to think differently about the mind. The mind is not something passive, because if you have a vessel, think like a bucket. It does absolutely nothing. Somebody else does something to the bucket to make it useful. They fill it up with water or whatever they need to fill it up with. But the vessel does nothing on its own. He wants people to understand that the mind is not passive like that. It's not what's done to the mind that makes it important. But the mind is active, like a fire burning. When a fire burns, it does things to other objects. He wants to point out that the mind is like that because learning comes from interest, desire, and an honest curiosity. It can't really be forced into a person unless they themselves are actively interested and involved in what they're learning. And that's his point here. So he helps people think differently about the mind by using this analogy. Trivia. The word analogy is a Greek word which means proportion or correspondence. Correspondence meaning something is like something else. Because an analogy is a comparison in which the relationship between one group of objects is shown to correspond to the relationship between another group of objects. Again, it's the relationships that are important. We understand one relationship by comparing it to another relationship of objects. Now, there is something very mysterious about analogies, and those who study the function and purpose of language have long been aware of this mystery. Now, why are we even able to make analogies at all? Why are we able to recognize similarities in things? Is it because they are similar in reality? Or is it because of other things going on in our minds? Or is it both? Regardless, it remains a mystery. And we are the only creature who has the ability to come up with analogies. And it leads to knowledge and understanding. All knowledge and understanding in some way or another is related to analogies. Because when we come up with analogies in order to explain something, it's a sure sign that the person coming up with the analogy understands what he or she is talking about. But also, the explanation of new things and even scientific discoveries requires using analogies. You saw that with the example of the atom. It required using an analogy of the solar system in order to understand what the atom was like. But also, when we come up with new things like the internet, words like website and mouse, they refer to other things. They're actually analogies. Website literally means the spider's web. Mouse refers to the creature that runs around. Why? Because the object that we use to guide the cursor on the computer looks like a mouse. And because everything in the internet is connected like a spider's web, we call one part of that web a website. These two videos on similes and metaphors are important because both similes and metaphors are types of analogies depending upon the way they are used. Thanks for watching. Until next time.